Hey everyone! Today I'm going to be following a sewing tutorial from a book I got at the library. I have almost no experience sewing, so I wanted to start with the basics and chose a tutorial for beginners. I was able to make this cat bag despite the difficulties that showed up along the way. First, I wrote down the material list and then headed to my local craft store. There was a lot of cute fabric choices, but I really wanted something with cats, and I was lucky to find something great. I also chose white calico because it's cheap. Using the guide and the instructions, I marked the lines I'd be cutting. I realized as I was hacking away, I hadn't purchased any extra fabric in case I messed up, so I tried to be careful. After the pieces were cut out, I layered the interfacing over the strap and ironed it on. However, I didn't read the instructions properly and ended up burning a piece of the interfacing. I thought the tutorial would be easy because it's rated for beginners, and right away that proved false. The first step gave instructions on how to fold the long strips so they could be used as straps, but the diagram wasn't clear and the instructions provided no help. I folded the strip in half, then folded each side underneath to create an even line with no rough edge. It wasn't perfect, but the results weren't bad. I was ready to make some progress, however, things would only get worse, and this time it wasn't the fault of the instructions. As soon as I started sewing, more problems arose. I only made it a few stitches before the thread broke. I cut all the stitches and tried again, but the thread broke once more. At this point, I wasn't really sure what to do, so I took a break. I've done a small amount of sewing in the past, so I wasn't sure why the string kept breaking. Logic would tell someone in my situation to Google the answer, but I felt overwhelmed. I was afraid the results would tell me the machine was broken in a way I couldn't fix. I've had this issue with being overwhelmed in the past. I guess it's just my mind's way of trying to avoid a bad result. If I don't know what the issue is, it's easier to ignore it. Stash told me to relax and try again, so that's what I did. For the fourth time, I rethreaded my machine. This time, I got through sewing the entire strap, but it still wasn't that great. There was a lot of bunching, and I was missing stitches. When I sewed the second strap, it went exactly the same. The thick edge was skipping stitches, but the thin edge was fine. Instead of fussing about it, I just decided to move on to the next step. Next, I was supposed to pin the lining pieces together and then sew them. The tutorial wanted me to do something special with the corners that I'd never tried before. I sewed the two pieces of the lining together. I wanted to continue, but I got stuck again. I couldn't figure out how I was supposed to fold the corners, and the diagram didn't really help. After a few minutes, I gave in and asked my boyfriend for help deciphering the instructions. Eventually, we figured it out. Next, I sewed both corners together and then trimmed the edges. Now it was time to work on the outer layer of the bag. When I saw I was supposed to use the interfacing again, I flipped to another part of the book and actually realized I'd done things completely wrong. I pinned the two pieces together and then sewed. Next, I ironed the seam down flat. Once the two pieces were put together, I realized one was larger than the other. My cutting hadn't really been accurate at all, so I trimmed the extra piece so they lined up. Once I'd trimmed the interfacing, it was time to iron it on. Because I actually read the instructions this time, I grabbed a spray bottle and a cloth. Next, I ironed the interfacing using the proper method. At this point, I was done for the day. It was getting late. The mistakes had eaten up a lot of time and lowered my courage. Later that evening, I felt brave enough to Google why the string kept breaking and why I kept missing stitches. The first solution was to change my sewing needle. Thankfully, I found a spare needle in my sewing box. When I compared the two needles the next day, I could see how dull my needle had become. I decided to redo the straps, and the difference was massive. After I changed the needle, the stitches came out perfectly even. The strap no longer seemed to be scrunched up and pulled too tight. Now it was time to attach the handles to the top of the bag. Sewing the handles made me glad I'd changed the needle. The fabric was thick, and there was no way the dull needle would have worked at all. The next step was to add a decorative top stitch. Next, it was time to put the two outside pieces together. The instructions wanted me to box the corners, as I'd done earlier with the lining. Boxing the corners wasn't as intimidating this time because I'd already done it with the lining and it had turned out okay. I followed the same steps as I'd done with the lining. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty exciting to see it look like a real bag. The tutorial realized I was feeling confident and decided to get revenge. The instructions were deceptively simple. I was supposed to attach the lining to the inside of the bag along the top. I turned the bag right side out, and it was really nice to see how it had all come together. I put the outer section into the lining, right sides facing each other. Following the instructions, I sewed right across the top. As soon as I tried to turn the bag right side out, I noticed everything had gone wrong. I unstitched what I'd just done, not really sure what had gone wrong. I wasn't sure what to do, and the instructions weren't helping. I ended up looking up a video tutorial on how to sew a tote bag. I watched how to attach the lining. I put the outer layer inside the lining and marked a gap so I could turn the bag right side out again. This time, I sewed only along the edges. When I turned the bag right side out, it was really exciting because it actually worked. All I had to do next was hand sew the gap where I'd turned the bag the right side out. The instructions said to hand sew the seam with a ladder stitch, and I had no idea what that was. Once again, the instructions weren't very clear. I tried to sew it together, but didn't really know what I was doing. Seeing how bad it looked, I finally Googled how to do it properly. I really didn't want to ruin the bag on the last step. I'd put so much effort in so far that I really wanted to get it right. Finally, the bag was done. My boyfriend was so excited about how well I did, he asked me to make one for him too, so I did that the next day. All in all, the bag turned out great, and making the second one was easier now that I knew what I was doing. I was happy I'd done a good job despite the tutorial not being very clear. Finishing this project was really big for my self-confidence, and I'm excited to move on to the next one. Thank you for watching and stay tuned. My sewing adventures have only just begun.